Good morning. Welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley's Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney. I'm a recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you have not already done so. Membership forms are available on our website at humanists.org. That's humanist plural. If you are listening for the first time, welcome, and we invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all of our events listed on the website humanists.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. You can find out how to donate to our organization on the website humanists.org. So our speaker today is Jeff Justice, and his topic is the European Mortality Monitoring System. So in his talk, Humanist community member Jeff Justice will show you how to use Euromomo and compare it to our CDC website. We'll use the data to compare how the COVID-19 epidemic has played out in the various European countries. So as a quick introduction, and Jeff, you're good to take it away.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And I'm full screen now. Pretty soon I'll switch to slides. I have 41 slides, and it should take 41 minutes to finish the talk. And I changed the name of the talk from European Mortality Monitoring System to Humanism and Epidemiology, as I'll see here. So here's my first slide. About half of my slides are going to be taken from the European Mortality Monitoring System, but about a quarter are going to be from the CDC, and the rest are going to be things that I've picked up from all the books I've written. I've read on epidemiology over the year. This has been a hobby of mine for at least 40 years. I always thought stories of epidemiology were really interesting. I hope most of you recognize this picture. It's a monument to epidemiology in the middle of London. It's the Broad Street Pump. And it marks one of epidemiology's early successes. In 1854, there was by the way, the overall theory of this talk is humanism and epidemiology, but that in a way that I'm using the scientific method in epidemiology. How does the scientific method apply to epidemiology? Humanism is for advancing the quality of life for humans using the scientific model, and so that's the overall theory of this talk. Well, anyway, 1854, the cholera epidemic was in London, for a particular section of London, and people had no idea what caused cholera. The prevailing idea was bad air, and so there was a large perfume industry to sell people ways to make the air smell better. And then finally, a fellow made a map of where the cases were going to be found, and here's the famous map that he made. He noted that these 100 cholera cases were all clustered around the Broad Street water well. There was no piped-in water at the time, and people were drinking out of a well that he thought was giving them cholera. And so using this map, he was able to convince people to take the handle off of the Broad Street water pump And as soon as that was done, everyone had to find the water elsewhere, and the amount of cholera went down dramatically. So that was an early success of epidemiology. You didn't have to know whether cholera was caused by a virus or a bacterium. All you had to know was that it came from the water, and so that started the effort to clean up the water. When you don't have that information, a lot of funny things happen. And this next slide tells one of the good stories about that happening. So in 1793, yellow fever was a very feared disease. It's a gruesome disease with a terrible death and 50% fatality rate back then. And the United States was, our capital was in Philadelphia, and already by 1793, the country had polarized into the Federalists party led by Hamilton and Washington, and the Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. So yellow fever came to Philadelphia, and people had no idea what was causing it, so they were social distancing and they were perfuming the air. If you got yellow fever, the therapy was to bleed the patient and to give them enemas. So against this background, Alexander Hamilton and his wife both got yellow fever. So he was a public person, and immediately that was known, and George Washington immediately sent him a get well card along with 6 bottles of wine. Definitely need that. But Thomas Jefferson penned a little essay saying that Hamilton was a wimp. He really just had a cold. And so it was immediately politicized. Hamilton decided not to do the bleeding and enema therapy, so he found a doctor that gave him lavender tea and cold baths. And amazingly, Hamilton and his wife recovered in 5 days. So Hamilton being Hamilton, he immediately wrote an essay on how wonderful his therapy was and how good his doctor was. And immediately you had the Federalist therapy for yellow fever and the Republican therapy for yellow fever. So all this was not knowing what yellow fever is. And for those that remember your history, this next slide is a little reminder. 100 years later, Walter Reed finally does a controlled experiment where he has people sleep in tents with mosquitoes. Unethical by today's standards, but it finally found out that if you control mosquitoes, you control yellow fever. Again, you didn't need drugs, and you didn't need to know whether it was a virus or a bacterium. You just need to know where the control mechanism was. So those are 2 of the classic stories of epidemiology. There's many, many more. I recommend books on it. But I'm going to switch gears a little bit now to start in on why this is interesting, or why it gets difficult. So these are pictures of me in 2002, spaced by 2 months. I was diagnosed with lymphoma at the time, which had a 50% death rate. And there are a couple of reasons that I put this slide in there. Partly because one of the reasons is that most of this presentation is going to be numbers and graphs. And some people don't relate to numbers and graphs. They want to have personal interest stories. In fact, most people are probably like that. Whereas epidemiologists like numbers and graphs. I probably couldn't sell this to a newspaper, this talk to a newspaper, but they might be able to buy these pictures or something. Well, anyway, the therapy for lymphoma is to drive the immune system down. You basically kill the B lymphocytes because it's a cancer of the B lymphocytes. And so while your immune system is, oh, by the way, the second picture, in the process of killing your B lymphocytes, they also kill your hair follicles. And so the second picture is 2 months later when my hair had started to fall out. This was early on. Eventually my eyebrows and every hair in my body went away. Plus they kill your red blood cells. That's why I got so white in the second picture. So in this course of getting your chemotherapy, you're very likely to get an opportunistic infection, it's called. And then you die of pneumonia instead of cancer. And so the second reason I put up this slide is to show that the doctor has to have some judgment in filling out the death certificate. He has to know, he would put that the opportunistic infection was the immediate cause of death, but the cancer was the underlying cause of death. So filling out death certificates is something that doctors have to be taught. And this next slide shows the opposite viewpoint. So this is someone with cancer, Kaposi's syndrome. And yet if this person dies, well, the doctor will put Kaposi's as the first reason for the death. But the second reason, the underlying cause, will be AIDS. So almost all Kaposi's syndrome is for people with AIDS. And the doctors know that AIDS is the underlying cause, and they know not to go further than that, so they stop it at AIDS as being the underlying cause. And this next slide shows the death certificate that they have to fill out. So this is a death certificate that's 50 years, well, it's 70 years old, but it still illustrates the point. So in the middle there, you can see that the person died of cerebral thrombosis due to arteriosclerosis. So he had a heart attack. But then there's two more lines. And so the doctor writes in arteriosclerosis on this line, and then underneath that, he writes down diabetes. So the doctor has to know that diabetes was the underlying cause. And that's very important, especially for the American Diabetes Association. They say that there are 80,000 diabetes deaths per year. Well, no, the CDC says that. The American Diabetes Association says it's really 3 times that amount because doctors don't put it as the underlying cause quite often. There are about 1.5 million heart attacks per year. And so quite often the doctor stops there and with the heart attacks and doesn't go down to the deeper levels. It's a judgment. It takes judgment to fill these things out. And the other point is that there are about 3 million of these filled out in the US each year and 3 million in Europe. And so the CDC has to have quite a mechanism to process these things. And they've got to log in and translate all this verbiage into data in a database. Oh, and in so doing, they can't get the identity of the individual because that's private. All they can do is collect the statistics. So much of this death certificate is redacted to preserve the privacy of the individual. Okay, so now we're going to go to tables and graphs. And I'm going to switch to the most interesting epidemic, which is the one that's going on right now. Historical ones don't make the headlines as much. So here's our favorite epidemic, the COVID epidemic. And this is a table from worldometers.info. Worldometers doesn't generate this data directly. They collect it, but they're an expert in data display. And so they're a very popular site for finding out information about how the epidemic is going. And this giant table, first of all, they collect data for about 200 countries around the world. And in this particular presentation, I sorted the table according to who got hit by the COVID epidemic the most. And so these deaths per million, can you see my cursor, by the way? So hopefully I'm dragging the cursor over the area that I want you to see. Hopefully you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So the deaths per million, this table is sorted by deaths per million, and you see that San Marino has the most deaths per million, but it's a tiny country, and so that's really not too useful. Peru has jumped into the lead as the world leader in COVID deaths per million. It just passed up Belgium. Andorra is a tiny country. Spain is medium size, and they had a lot of deaths. The United Kingdom was 6th place with 611 deaths per million. Then Chile is still moving up the list because the epidemic is still going on in Chile. Then there's Italy, Brazil, the epidemic is still going on. The USA is in 10th place, and we just move ahead of Sweden, and Mexico is just below us. So that's the epidemic sorted by where it hit the hardest. Remember, there are 200 countries in the world and 50 states, so we have a lot of statistics. And we're going to have about 30 slides here of graphs and statistics. And hopefully you can relate to that. So here's the next one, which is the same table, but it's sorted by population of the country. So China is in first place, followed by India. So these are the 12 largest countries in the world. And here, looking at the deaths per million, you see that it varies by 2 orders of magnitude. It goes from 3 in China all the way up to 566 in Brazil. So huge variations from country to country. And then immediately you come up with explanations about why there's a variation. And those are called models or hypotheses. And if you're of a certain political ilk, you say, oh, China's lying. They really had more deaths than that. That's one way of looking at it. And other explanations are that China had natural immunity because the SARS-CoV-1 epidemic hit there. Another explanation is that they had some public health policy that was very successful, and so they were able to keep the epidemic down. And then for India, for instance, with 46 deaths per million, you could say, oh, their public health system doesn't work well enough to record deaths. And so they probably really had much more than that. But again, that's a hypothesis that would have to be tested. Now, we like to think that our health system works well. So we like to think that our number is accurate. And then there's Indonesia and Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Russia, Mexico. Now, Japan is interesting because it's a first world developed country with a very, very low death rate. And most people believe that in Japanese numbers. So the issue is that each country has slightly different rules on how to report deaths, and that affects the quality of the data. And getting this data is really important for controlling epidemics. And so Europe saw that problem during the swine flu epidemic of 2008-9, and they decided to do something about it because the estimates of how many people died in the swine flu epidemic varied widely. And so here's what they did about it. They formed the European Mortality Monitoring Project, Euromomo. And so about half the slides in this presentation are going to be Euromomo slides. About 300 million people live in the countries that they service, and they standardized on ways of reporting death and the rules that the doctor should use in filling out the death certificates. And they live slightly longer than Americans, but they still have about the same number of deaths per year, about 3 million per year. So this next slide is I guess the most viewed slide from the Euromomo site. You can go to euromomo.eu right now and see this slide. This is a plot of deaths per week from the European countries from the fall of 2016 up to present. And the first question is, why isn't there data before 2016? And you can dig to get that data, but they don't display it by default. And I think it's because the data isn't as good before 2016. I just used what was easily available, and the plot stops in the fall of 2016. The other thing is the yellow line at the end. This is data that isn't finished yet. The death certificates are still coming in for the last 3 weeks. So they estimate how many death certificates will come in. And so they know how to do that pretty well, but it's not perfect data. Now, the next thing is that the average number of deaths is around 50,000 per week. And there's a natural hump in the winter and a natural trough in the summer. And that's pretty standard. It goes up about 5,000 deaths per week in the winter and down about 3,000 deaths in the summer. But then on top of that, in the winter, in December and January, you get significant spikes or humps that vary from year to year. And the epidemiologists have looked into this, and they blame this almost entirely on flu epidemics. And so this flu epidemic was fairly severe in 2017. Now this one didn't go up as high, but it lasted longer. So there's actually more deaths in this 2018 flu epidemic, plus it had 2 humps. So they could ask, oh, is it 2 different viruses? Or you can ask all sorts of questions once you have this data. And then the 2019 flu epidemic was sort of medium. And then 2020, almost no flu epidemic, but then the giant COVID epidemic. So this system is really for detecting epidemics. And this red line, well, the gray line is sort of the 1 standard deviation around the average. The red line is 2 standard deviations. And whenever deaths per week go above 2 standard deviations, they say, oh, we probably have an epidemic. So this was an epidemic. That was probably a fake epidemic in summer of 2019. This was probably an epidemic. And then COVID definitely was an epidemic. And there's a secondary spike here. Well, maybe not. So that's the sort of thing you can gather from this data. But then they break it down further. And in particular, they break it down by age group. So we're going to go through the age groups now. So here's the same data, but displayed for 2 age groups. I'm going to go through all the age groups. And you see that for kids, you can't see any COVID epidemic at all. It's just noise. First of all, there's only 300 deaths per year in this age group, so they don't die a whole lot. But it's mostly noise. Even the flu epidemics aren't very bad for kids. But by the time you get to 15 to 44, the flu epidemics are small, but you start to see the COVID epidemic. So it's still small. That's only 200 deaths above normal at this point, but it's something. But then as you go up in age, you start to see the epidemics more clearly. Middle ages, you see the flu epidemics, and the COVID epidemic starts to stand out significantly. And then going up to 65 to 74, by the way, the scales have changed here. So the average deaths for this range, this age group is 6,500 per week. Now we're still at 6,500 per week, but the COVID epidemic spikes the number of deaths by 6,000 per week for this age group. And then going even further, by the time you get up to 75 to 84-year-old, now the COVID epidemic goes from 15,000 per week normal death up to 25,000 at the peak. And then here they summarize it also for people over 65. Again, significant as you get older. Now, the average lifespan in Europe is 81 years old. So you'd say, oh, there really aren't that many people over 81, but there are. So they do display the plot for people over 85 too. And so here, even though there's not many fewer people over 85, the average deaths per week is around 23,000. And the COVID epidemic spiked it up to 40,000. So the thing is that COVID hits the older groups significantly more than the younger groups. And that was figured out back in March from the Italy data. But here it's just confirmed by Euromomo. Now let's look at the data a little bit differently. And remember that Euromomo's purpose is to identify epidemics. And so whenever your average deaths per week go more than 2 standard deviations above average, it's supposed to give you a flag. And so for each of the countries in Europe, they make these plots with the red line showing 2 standard deviations above average. And so you can see that this 2017 Austria had a significant flu epidemic, and 2018 a little flu epidemic, but then basically nothing in 2019 and basically no COVID epidemic in Austria. But right next door, Belgium had a significant COVID epidemic. And now it's even having a little spike in August of this year. So you can learn a lot from looking at these graphs, and anybody can go to the Euromomo site and get this. Denmark had a flu epidemic in 2018, but basically no COVID epidemic. Now, every one of these countries is a separate story, but there's 20 of them, and I'm going to go through the slides real quick so you can see how each country fared. Estonia must be pretty healthy. They didn't have a flu epidemic or a COVID epidemic. Finland, and they're healthy people there. No COVID epidemic, hardly a flu epidemic. But France, significant COVID epidemic, pretty good sized flu epidemic too. And going on. And now Germany as a whole didn't volunteer for Euromomo because I think privacy, but Berlin and another region of Germany volunteered, and so they submit their data. And you see that Berlin didn't have a COVID epidemic, but they had a flu epidemic, and another region of Germany hardly had a COVID epidemic. Greece hardly had a COVID epidemic. Here's Hungary. Now, Ireland had a significant COVID epidemic, but I think it's interesting because now their deaths per week is below average by more than a standard deviation. So something's changed there that has made them do better. And of course, Italy had a COVID epidemic, but again, its deaths per week has returned to average and has been in the average band for 8 to 12 weeks. As has most of Europe. Luxembourg is fairly small. You can hardly see anything happening there. Malta is small. The Netherlands, noted for being healthy people, but they had a significant COVID epidemic. Their deaths per week returned to average about 12 weeks ago. There's been a little blip lately, but right now they're back at average. Norway, pretty healthy country, almost no flu epidemics or COVID epidemics. Portugal sort of occasionally blips above 2 standard deviations. Spain had a flu epidemic and a COVID epidemic, a significant one. It's got its death rate back to normal, and then recently it's gone up slightly. And then Sweden, pretty healthy, but then they had a COVID epidemic, and it's been trending down, and it's been back to normal for about six weeks now. And probably most of you know the story of Sweden. It should take its own slide. I'll explain that to you later. Sweden had a very weak, if non-existent lockdown. Switzerland had a very mild lockdown. They did have a COVID epidemic, but they returned to normal about 12 weeks ago. And then there's United Kingdom, which is broken into England, which had a significant epidemic, but it's been back to normal about 8 weeks. And the pubs opened up, I don't know, 6 weeks ago. Here are the various parts of the United Kingdom: Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Their story is pretty similar to England itself. A significant epidemic, but it returned to normal about 6 to 8 weeks ago. So that's the 20 countries in Europe very quickly. And we have the same data for all the states in the United States. But I'm going to go on with another way of displaying the data. This is from the Euromomo site, and it just shows the cumulative deaths since January 1st for 3 years. And you can see that 2019 was a mild flu season with 68,000 excess deaths. 2018 was worse with 118,000 excess deaths. And then the COVID season, COVID year of 2020, currently we're running at 2006 excess deaths. The line is pretty flat right now, so that it could be that these numbers are similar to what we'll finish out the year with. Another thing I should say, by the way, is that a feature of epidemics is that there's a lot of bad information out there. So for each of my slides, I reference where I got the data. And most of them come from Euromomo, but there'll be slides from CDC and Worldometers. But here a good scientist wants to check his data from another source. And we're really lucky that we have this Center for Disease Control collecting data with our own rules and our own system. And we make plots that are roughly equivalent to the European plots. So this is the plot of our deaths per week in the United States. And again, it averages around 50,000 per week with peaks in the winter. You can see that, oh, and by the way, this plot starts January 2017. So we had a significant flu outbreak in January 2018. Almost no flu outbreak in the US in January 2019. And our COVID epidemic trailed Europe by 2 to 3 weeks. And we went up and we were coming down just like Europe, but unlike Europe, we have had another bump here. And so Europe came back to normal at this point, whereas we have another bump. And everybody can have their own theory about why that's happening. I'm just, well, I've got to move on. So this is the CDC data confirming that this is highly oriented toward older groups. You can see that for people under 25 years old, you can't see any COVID deaths at all. It's always within normal range. By the time you're 25 to 44, you start to see a little bit of data, a few deaths. And then as you get older, it grows dramatically. And then the question is it because you're older, or is it because as you get older, you have comorbidities? You have heart disease and diabetes and obesity and all the other problems of being older. I'll just raise that as a question. I won't try to answer that question. I'll just note that the data says older people are hit much harder. Now, we should be happy. Well, this is a plot from the CDC site. And again, you can go to this website and get the plot for this week's data. This was captured last week. But they also report the number of deaths for some other things other than COVID that are above average. And so since February 1st, 2020, here are like 12 other reasons that you can die that they've summed up where the doctor didn't put COVID on the death certificate. And you see that dementia, for instance, Alzheimer's and dementia, 25,000 extra deaths from Alzheimer's and dementia. And then heart attacks, another 13,000 heart attacks since February 1st. So you sum up all these bars and you get 78,000 deaths above average from things that weren't marked COVID on the death certificate. Again, we could spend hours discussing what this is from. I'm just presenting the data right here. And then, so all this data from the countries and we have the states for the United States are sort of uncontrolled experiments because every country has its own rules. But we have one controlled experiment that's sort of interesting. We have the Diamond Princess that it's controlled because we know how many people were there and we know that they mixed and for how long they mixed. So this is about as good, as close to control as you have in the epidemiology world. The cruise started from Yokohama, Japan, in January 20th, 2020. 3,700 people on board. Average age of the passengers, 65, typical cruise. For 10 days, they just walked around the ship normally, eating from the cafeterias. And then after 10 days, they decided that they had disease on board, and so they confined the passengers to cabins while the crew continued to run the ship. So we know that how much mixing went on, and the CDC went in and did PCR tests. PCR was invented in 1990 for DNA, but became widely available in the swine flu, well, somewhat available in the swine flu epidemic, and now it's widely used. You have to use reverse transcriptase PCR for all the RNA viruses out there. So the CDC had figured out how to do that, and 81% of the passengers tested negative with PCR, and 19% tested positive, which meant they had fragments of the virus in them. And of those that tested positive, 54% had no symptoms, 46% had symptoms of the illness, and then finally 13 died. So that report is on the CDC website, and that's as close to controlled experiment as we get in this world. Everybody has theories about what's going on. And in the scientific world, if you propose a hypothesis, and then you see whether the hypothesis matches the data that you've generated. Hopefully you have data to test it with. If you don't have data, you can still have a podcast and talk about it for hours and hours. But in the scientific world, you like to have data to test things. So the most famous hypothesis in the COVID world is the one produced by the Imperial College, the COVID response team. It came out in March 2020. And because of that, it scared everybody. British politicians went into lockdown because it predicted 510,000 UK deaths and 2.2 million United States deaths. And this is a screenshot, a clip from that report. But again, you can quickly go and read that report and see what they thought. So they used a model, they plugged in some numbers, and they produced these graphs. And with only the data that they had back in March. And then, so now we have data, and we can see how this model fits the data. The easy one to remember, deaths per million, 7,600 for the UK and slightly less, 6,700 for the US, according to their model. So we now have data. First, the United Kingdom, here's the Worldometers plot for their deaths. It went up and peaked in late April and has been going down and is pretty darn close to zero now. So they ended up with 611 deaths per million, which is about 7% of what the Imperial College model predicted. And it's a little more complicated for the United States because we're still getting deaths coming in. The deaths peaked back in April, but we're still in the tail end here. And currently we're at 578 deaths per million, which is less than UK. But who knows how long this tail is going to go and how much we'll end up with. So any model that you want to produce now, we have data to test it with. And I'm going to go through 10 or 12 different plots of deaths. And you can sort of form models for each one of them. But I'm going to say that that's not part of this talk. That's not part of the talk to propose one model over another. I'm just going to say you should fit all of this data. So here we go through 9 slides that show various outcomes. First of all, here's Hawaii. The tourist economy out in the middle of the Pacific ends up with a death rate 1/10 of the rest of the United States, 56 per million. Now, why was their epidemic so much different from our epidemic? Now we're in California, so here's the plot for California. We're currently at 341 deaths per million, better than the United States, but it's a different curve than Hawaii and from the other places I'm going to show you. So, for instance, here's Colorado. Their deaths did peak in May. Their total deaths per million is about the same as in California, but the deaths has come down dramatically. And it doesn't show the long tail that California is showing. Here's New York City, New York State, which had the worst outbreak on the planet back in April. They have 3 times more deaths than the rest of the United States. But the interesting thing is that the death rate has fallen to almost 0. And there are days in New York City now where there are no deaths. So a model should try to explain that. And then going on, this is the one that came out late, but now is the death capital, COVID capital of the world. Peru, Southern Hemisphere, the epidemic started late, but it's gone up. They went into heavy lockdown with curfews and fines, and they're currently at 890 deaths per million, and the epidemic is still going on. Now, Brazil started late also. Their death rate's gone up, but they had a very light lockdown, and their death rate is 597 per million currently. And going on, so this is the one that everyone likes to talk about because this is the country with the lightest lockdown. They didn't close the schools. They didn't close the restaurants. Less than 10% of the people wear masks. They still have get-togethers, go to church. And it looked bad back in April. But then it's come down, and their death rate is now lower than the United States and lower than Britain. Plus, it's been pretty close to 0 for the last 8 weeks. So interesting situation there. And then as you go around the world, this is a standout. Vietnam, death rate 0.4 people per million, for a country with 97 million people. Now, what's going on here? You could say, oh, it's a developing country and they aren't reporting their deaths properly, but it's partly developed. But that is one explanation. Another is that there's natural immunity going on. And so, for some reason, the Vietnamese have natural immunities to COVID. But whatever model you have, you've got to explain why their death rate is so low. And the same is true for Japan. It isn't as low as Vietnam, but it's 10 per million. It's less than it's like 2% of the United States for a country that's developed with a good public health system. Like 90% of the people wear masks outdoors, but they didn't shut down the restaurants and schools. Well, they had a different public policy. And so any model that you have should try to explain all of this. And so my summary for this talk is that we now have data to test ideas, and let's use the scientific process. So here's where I got my data: Euromomo, CDC, Worldometers. Here's my email if you'd like to talk about anything. And these are a couple of good books: Viruses, Plagues, and History. Really good stories about plagues that we know about. And Hamilton, a really good biography with all sorts of interesting information. So I'll stop sharing now, and we can have questions if you like, or discussion. Did I stop?
Thanks, Jeff. We'll wait for people to raise their hands. I guess my first question for you is, let's say you have COVID-19, but you're, a MAGA hat wearing individual whose boat sinks and you die when your boat sinks. Does that count? I'm joking.
Makes good podcast material, but I don't know that epidemiologists would think about that one way or the
other. A real question from the chat. is actually from Debbie Allen, who is here. I don't know if she's still here. How long has Alzheimer's disease and dementia been listed as the leading cause of death? I don't know if you can answer that one. Is a question in the
Yeah, I
chat.
can answer it approximately because I know that it's really hard to diagnose Alzheimer's, but somehow the CDC figured out how to do it, and it is listed as it's in the top 10 causes of death in the United States. So I think it's up to the judgment of the doctor, but they can't do a biopsy on the brain. Well, I guess they can after you're dead, but still, it is a major cause of death in the United States.
Yeah. Okay, we got a hand up. Laura and Mark. You should be unmuted. Looks like it's going to be Mark. Go for it.
Yes, hi. So Jeff, I noticed a couple of your graphs, like the the US daily deaths chart, looked like they had 5 days of high deaths and then 2 days of low, and then 5 days of high. Is that like weekend, low reporting on weekends, or what's going on there?
Yeah, epidemiologists deal with real data, and people don't die on weekends, as we all know. They die on Monday. And you'd think that you die and immediately the hospital sends in the death certificate, but no, sometimes it takes 3 or 4 weeks to get to the CDC. Depends on what part of the country you're in.
Okay, before we go on to the next hand up, we had another question in the chat from Susan and Roy. There seems to be a strong relationship between pre-existing conditions and death. Is there a global chart for viewing that? So is there a chart linking pre-existing conditions and deaths? I assume that's comorbidities.
Yes, that data does exist, and but it wasn't in my talk. In particular, the best data comes from the New York Department of Health. If you Google it, very early they made charts of that broke out comorbidities versus age. And I'm 71 years old, and I immediately wanted to know what my issues were, and so I immediately wanted to know how much of the larger risk is due to age and how much is due to the comorbidities. And I didn't have that in my slide presentation, but that data is available from the New York Department of Health.
Okay. We have Marianne. Marianne. You'll have to,
okay.
There you go.
Yeah, I've been hearing for weeks, maybe not the last week or so, but that the United States is the highest COVID rating. I don't know if it was death or overall, but whatever, that we're the highest. So where does that fit in? Is that just another way of looking at it, or another, not Euromomo, or what do we have that keeps showing that, or do we keep hearing it all the time?
Yeah, I bet that that they're talking about cases rather than deaths. A case occurs whenever the PCR test shows that there are fragments of the virus in the body. And since we have the largest testing mechanism, and it's a very sensitive test, you can pick up a large number of cases. The epidemiologists would take that into account, but the thing that really rings the bell is when there's a death or when somebody goes to the hospital. So a huge number of cases never go to the hospital. Now, if you were to culture my throat right now, you would find streptococcus, for instance, in my throat, because almost everybody has streptococcus in their throat, but I don't have strep throat. Similarly, if you were to culture my stomach right now, you'd find H. pylori, but I don't have ulcers. So Should that be called a case? Well, depends on what you think.
No, but it'd be interesting, but probably even more horrifying, if we had a way of tracing how many people, are seriously affected the rest of their lives, either from whatever,
Yeah.
side effects of COVID.
Right.
Into the ventilators and stuff like that.
It's a new epidemic, and we don't have that data yet. Flu occasionally does cause long-term illnesses. And a certain percentage of the COVID deaths drag on for, of the COVID sicknesses drag on for months, we know, but we haven't traced them, of course, for years yet.
Thank you.
Okay. Ray is next with his hand up. Ray, you'll probably have to unmute. Okay.
Okay, Jeff, thanks for your talk. I've got a question from near the beginning of your talk. You said that Jon Snow detected what was causing cholera. Do you know anything about his background, how he had the ability to do this?
I read that story 30 years ago, and I think they called him a physician, but he was somebody inclined toward numbers. So epidemiology is a different type of physician from the person that interacts with individual patients. And that's part of the interest of epidemiology and humanism in particular, because you have to decide, if you're a doctor, are you going to treat individual patients, or are you going to do epidemiology and try to treat a broad population? And there are different ethical and moral issues involved there.
Thank you.
Ray, I just posted a link to a YouTube video in the chat on a really good, it's actually a cartoon, overview of the story of Jon Snow and the Broad Street Pomp. So if you want more background there.
Okay.
And anybody else? Moving on, it looks like it's Susan and Roy. I'm thinking it's Roy.
Okay, Jeff, you and I have talked about, I have an epidemiological concern, but it's not about the start, how it got started. I proposed radioactivity, but we won't go there. I just saw a movie called it's about Dr. Ehrlich and his magic bullet. And among even cholera, he worked on sexual diseases, syphilis, and all kinds of stuff. And he was involved in diphtheria for children. And it turned out that their best shot at the time was a cross-species antibodies. I remember they talked about them when I was in the 10th grade or something like that, that they used horses, which is a cross-species. And the thought occurred to me that if indeed the start, or at least the rotation of back and forth of the viruses, that the bat could have, given this the problem. Now, if we let a bat, cross-species, settle down and extract, because he's got a good antibody, because he doesn't really get sick. So I have not seen in the investigations of cross-species, other than monkeys or gorillas, but the famous one would be if the bat started it, we could use his antibodies as a vaccine, a serum. They used the word serum in the early 19th century, but the vaccine at that time was only for, using cowpox for, the other pox. What's the question? Yeah, well, the question or the concern is it possible you think that the bat's antibodies would be a good so-called serum for treatment?
Oh, it's definitely possible, and it's been done before. There are probably 24 possible treatments for COVID-19 that are out there, and that's one of the ones that's being investigated.
Cross species?
I bet they're investigating cross species also.
My point, yeah.
The issue is scalability. How do you get enough antibodies to treat thousands of patients, and purity? How do you prove that it doesn't have some other problem with it that's going to make you even sicker?
So I want to make a comment on this particular question as well. Bats have an unusual immune system from what I've heard, and that they don't actually, like, their immune system doesn't do a whole lot to fight off these infections, and they seem to rely a lot on just their body temperature. They tend to run like a fever all the time, it seems. And so I'm not sure you can actually get any kind of antibodies from a bat that would be helpful in humans. However, I did hear that they were trying some or infecting camels or something, and using their blood and antibodies for serums. And there's some special reason for that. Camels have some special stuff in their blood that makes them a good candidate for that. I don't know the details, but that was interesting.
Well, camels had something to do with MERS.
Right. Well, they were using it for this COVID-19. They were looking into it for COVID-19 as a treatment, not a vaccine. If I find the article, or video, wherever I found it, I'll post it. But yeah, I don't know all the details. I don't want to spread any rumors or anything, but that was just something that I looked up or ran across at some point.
Right. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Try to move on.
Mm-hmm.
To Senna and Alex. Yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the graphs, and a couple of interesting things I saw. One of them is when you were showing deaths by age group, it struck me that under 20, there's practically no deaths whatsoever. That says something about the health of our young people. I don't know if that was a worldwide graph or not. The other thing that struck me is when you were showing graphs over the 4-year period, there's a peak in the winter in deaths. And I noticed generally a ripple in the middle of summer, and I'm guessing that was from people partying and getting themselves killed. Is that reasonable?
That's reasonable. That would be a testable hypothesis that a good epidemiologist could get their PhD on.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff in the graphs.
Uh-huh.
The other thing I was wondering about, when you were talking about filling out death certificates, and especially heart attacks, my impression is that before diagnoses were all that accurate, heart failure was a general cause of death when they couldn't find anything else.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if overweight would be a contributing factor. If it's mentioned on the death certificate, that's a fairly widespread problem.
Right, and those are questions that don't have exact answers, and the CDC just issues policies, and the Euromomo just issues policies, and every country in the world has its own policy, and that, to a large extent, gives rise to differences in comparative statistics between the various countries and states. So, for one time there was a theory that France had fewer heart attacks than the U.S. did. And it's called the French paradox, and because they eat all this fatty food and they drink a lot of wine, and then eventually it was figured out, oh, no, they just mark their death certificates differently. They don't put down heart disease as much as the US does.
Darn it. That means wine is not going to prevent heart attacks, huh?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Fran and Jim.
Get to unmute.
You're unmuted.
Unmuted.
Mhm.
I have a question and then I have a comment. First, I had all the characteristic symptoms of COVID back in February. Loss of smell and fever and fatigue and all this, the classic symptoms. Fran then had got it much more milder symptoms. And then her daughter, who lives with us, got a still milder case, she being much younger. The question I'd like to know is, would you raise your hand if you know you suspect you had COVID or know someone in your immediate circle that did? I just wonder how prevalent this was back in the early days before COVID had been recognized as being present in California. No one else? Oh, okay, Alex. Yeah.
I put my thumb up.
Yeah.
I know somebody who definitely got it and got a test and tested positive.
Mhm.
They're not in California, though.
Uh-huh. Well, it seemed to have been here much earlier than it was recognized, because I went to my doctor and he had diagnosed me with pneumonia. But as it developed the characteristic symptoms. So I'm almost certain that's what I had.
Did you ever get
just an aside that I think might be interesting to some people. As a biochemist, I worked with developing a cholera vaccine with SmithKline and French back in the 70s. What was interesting was I was often, well, occasionally, up to my elbows in cholera bacteria. And what was interesting was that no one working with cholera in the labs ever seemed to contract the disease. And years later, I read that the cholera bacterium itself does not cause the disease, but it becomes infected with a virus. And when the virus infects the bacterium, it leads to production of the toxin that causes cholera. So I just thought that would throw that out as an aside, and it might apply to other bacteria as well.
Yeah, every disease has interesting stories like that.
Uh-huh.
And of course, you can be tested for antibodies now. $10, you can get an antibody test. But if you had COVID, you only have like a 50% chance of having antibodies to it, maybe even less.
Yeah. I had an antibody test, and it came out negative.
Yeah. So that's a new thing that needs to be explained. Why? Well, we don't know if you had COVID, so.
Well, his doctor said it was because he was old.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing, is that this is a disease of old people, and old people don't react as well to vaccines.
Yeah.
Because they don't produce antibodies as much. So will the vaccine help? To be determined.
Yeah.
Will the vaccine be tested on young people and then given to old people?
There is a question in the chat. It's kind of a long one, but if I distill it down, you can read the whole thing if you want. But basically, it's asking, or asserts that Africans are not getting, or actually not, I think, dying from COVID as higher rates, and is wondering why that is. Is it because of other issues? And I don't know if you've seen that in the charts at all.
Oh, I haven't seen that in the graphs of Euromomo and World of Meters. The dramatic thing in World of Meters is how much China, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, how low their death rates are. And you say, oh, it's genetics. Well, no, it could be that they've already been exposed to similar viruses, and they have similar, they have some immunity. Those are just hypotheses, but worth testing.
Yeah, I heard that, or there was a theory that places like Japan and Korea and China and some other East Asian countries were not getting as affected because they had outbreaks of SARS, and it wasn't that they because that wasn't a big outbreak or anything. It didn't really spread throughout the population, but because it was so deadly, people were really serious, and like everybody's wearing masks. Like here, maybe half the people you see outside are wearing masks, but in those countries, virtually everybody is, just because they have experience with similar viruses.
Yeah.
Did you ever see that in your charts? I mean, I know you didn't show anything, but tracking like mask usage with spreading rates, or I don't even know if you can do that.
Yeah, certainly Japan has heavy mask usage. I don't know about Vietnam and Indonesia. Sweden has almost no mask usage.
Really?
And our death rate is higher than Sweden's and still growing. So it's a little bit of a test. Whether it's a definitive test, I don't know.
Okay.
And Denmark had no masks for a while, and then they went back to masks. So every country has a different story. And England evidently allows you to go into the pubs without a mask now and eat in the pub as long as they serve food. But there's different rules for every country.
Okay. I have Paul. You're unmuted. I don't know which Paul. Paul will have to unmute himself. He is not unmuting himself. Okay, he doesn't seem to be responding, so we'll move on to Alex or Senna and Alex.
We have a very level-headed guy in the humanist community who believes that he had it before it got popular. He had all the symptoms, and he just believes that he had it.
I've also got a friend who was traveling in Asia, came back, developed symptoms of coronavirus, and isolated himself for a while, and he's since recovered. However, recently he broke out in shingles. And that's another possible side effect that if the flu doesn't kill you, it might make you susceptible to something else. And supposedly most of us have the shingles virus in our system.
There's a vaccination for that.
So there's a thing called attention bias. Whatever you're thinking about is what you make as a selection. And if you're thinking about COVID, then every time you get the littlest headache or a runny nose, it's COVID.
I know I feel that all the time. I've been experiencing off and on slight symptoms of that I think is just allergies, but every time it happens I think, oh no, I got it. Got the COVID, but I don't. Okay, Chip is just mentioned in the chat that he has a question. So by the way, the raise hand feature is at the bottom of the participants window. So you have to click the participants button at the bottom of the main window, and then you should either see it at the bottom of your participants window or under more. That's on like a Mac or a PC. If you're on an iPad, I think it's somewhere in the same place, but I'm not exactly sure where it is. The interface is a little bit different. But Chip, I can go ahead and unmute you. And
hello.
If you have a question, go ahead and ask.
Yeah, I didn't scroll all the way to the bottom of the participants. One thing that I have noticed is the very interesting slides on variation over time in death rate. And I've been, in my own looking at this, I've been concentrating on case rate. And I noticed that some of these death rate, case rates, the death rate slides from country to country and excess deaths and all of that, perhaps that data has been influenced by improvements in ICU procedures to improve survival in the ICU and the use of ventilators and all that. Could the speaker comment on how, I mean, can we get the data for ICU? You go into the ICU, how many of them come out? See if that has changed over the course of the epidemic as experimental drugs and other procedures have come online. Thank you.
So I think ICU data is available online. I didn't get into that in this talk, and I haven't looked at it extensively. I have heard that doctors are getting better, but I don't have actual data to support that. As far as cases go, I do understand RT-PCR, and it's a really sensitive technique that, and this is the first major epidemic it's been used on. It was just being developed in 2008 for the swine epidemic. So we can now detect the smallest little fragment of a virus in your throat. And then the question is always, is that virus active? No, we know, you can detect really just a few virus particles in your throat. They have a thing called the cycle number with PCR tests that tells how many doubles they had to go through in order to get a detection. And that data is available. So if they had to go through more than 10 doubles to detect the virus, that virus is way down there in the noise. And a lot of them are calling positive things that had to go through 20 doubles in order to detect the virus. So calling it just positive or negative is sort of simplistic. The same thing, problems exist with antibody tests too, but that's a whole different story. It could be another 2-hour talk.
Okay, we have Dana and probably Jerry is.
Yeah, it's Jerry this time. Yeah, a couple of things on the usage of ventilators. The usage of ventilators has evolved over time as they learn more about the COVID. And also another thing they've done, they didn't do in the beginning, was something called pronating, where they have people lie on their stomach, because somehow that's supposed to mean less drowning happens.
Postural drainage, that's what old.
Postural drainage. So, but apparently that's important in COVID. So 2 more things to make things complicated. More complicated.
Yeah.
That's it.
Again, I think that the data for how much doctors are improving is available, but I didn't look into it myself. So you can actually plot curves that show that you go into the hospital and you're more likely to be cured than you were 3 months ago. But I don't know how much.
Or why?
Well, it's from a million different little things: laying on your stomach, proper use of ventilators, use of dexamethasone, a whole lot of little things.
Nursing care, maybe.
Yep.
How good it is.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see anybody else with their hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and we can start the general discussion and allow everybody to unmute themselves. But before we get into the general discussion, we can all now give a hand to Jeff. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for letting me talk. This gave me a reason to put down all this information in one place. I just naturally collect this information, but putting it down was fun.
Good.